It's Wednesday, March 24th, 2021, and this is yet another socially distant edition of KBIA's Views of the News. I'm Amy Simons, coming to you from the studio in the Reynolds Journalism Institute, and along with me are my colleagues, Ernest Perry and Kiely, and we're here for our weekly conversation on media behaviors. Hi, Ernest.
Hi, everybody.
Good to see you, and hi, Kathy. Good to have you here with us today, too.
Hey, Amy. Hey, Ernest.
So on our program this week.
This has got to stop. Every week in the United States, there's a shooting.
2 mass killings in fewer than 2 weeks. We're going to talk about the similarities and the differences and how the news media covered each of these. Also, the latest trend in art, digital files that you really can't do anything with. We're going to talk about these NFTs and why they're suddenly booming. And the NFL has signed more than $100 billion in new TV deals. Only those contracts didn't all go to television networks. There's a lot more that hopefully we'll get to as well, but I want to start with those 2 mass shootings, which have dominated headlines since we last met. 18 people dead, 10 of them at a grocery store getting food, supplies, even COVID vaccines, 8 of them at the spas and businesses where they worked. For the past year, there has been so much news coverage focused on the pandemic. And so it has been kind of easy for us to overlook that, according to research from the New York Times, there were more than 600 incidents in which 4 or more people were shot in 2020. That was up almost 200 from the year before. Kathy, one of the biggest questions that circulated on Monday after the shooting in Boulder was whether to air or even link to video that had come from inside the grocery store. It was live streamed to an audience of more than 300,000 by an eyewitness. CNN linked to that video on its homepage, showed portions of the air, edited portions of it on the air. Risky move?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think when you air something like that, you always have to ask the question, what is the benefit? What is the public interest in this? And yes, sometimes we do have to show disturbing images, and it's important. But in this case, I think we're seeing a lot of news organizations now really rethinking how we talk about perpetrators of such crimes, whether we name them, how we name them, how often we name them. And the reason behind that thinking, I think, should have been applied here, which is this tends to glorify violence. This is the kind of thing, we've seen it in some of the writings that have been unearthed after these incidents, that some of these perpetrators really are looking forward to the notoriety they receive for these kind of acts. And so I think anything we in the media can do to tamp down those expectations and to not glorify something horrendous. There's a titillation factor, no question about it. We've talked on this show before about clickbait, but boy, I think this is a case where a little bit of common sense should have been applied.
So, Ernest, KUSA TV aired the police radio traffic, the scanner radio, but did that well after the event ended and prefaced running that tape by saying that they wait to do this so as not to reveal any tactical police information which might be seen by suspects on what might be a still active scene as that shooting is still happening.
Yeah, and I think they did a pretty good job of setting it up for the viewers so that the audience would know this is, we've taken this way after the fact to sort of give the viewer the kind of context necessary to see here's what happens when police arrive at a scene or when they are first told about something happening, and then the steps that they're taking in trying to deal with this. So they did a really good job of setting it up at the beginning and then doing further explanation after they ran the scanner traffic, as we call it. Those of us who've done that work before. I mean, in listening to it, it reminded me of the many times as a police reporter that I was listening to the scanner as I'm headed out to the scene to do my story. to actually get a sense of what's going on. It is, I would say, the unvarnished information that not only police are getting as they try to move to the scene, but also what journalists are getting as they're trying to get to the scene.
And one of the things, too, that was brought up in that is we kind of talk about and compare this live video that was coming in versus how police scanner traffic was released by journalists. One of the things that, and I believe it was Kyle Clark who was trying to put this into context in the decisions from KUSA, that he mentioned is that what's on the scanner traffic is happening in real time, that not everything that's even being said by law enforcement or by dispatchers in the moment is true, right? One of the elements that was in that tape was that the officers on the scene had indicated that there might have been 2 shooters inside. So when you're running that in real time, you're potentially bringing misinformation into the reporting that's happening too.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that Kathy sort of hit upon, which is that when you pull in that live, you run the risk of there being some information that gets out there that is inaccurate. You run the risk of something that gets on the air that is titillating, but really doesn't add anything to as much to the story as providing that context at the beginning and at the end, which is what the television station did in the way in which it pulled together that scanner traffic. And they actually came out and said, look, initially they said that could have been as many as 3 shooters, and ultimately we realized that there was only 1. And then as they played the traffic, the scanner traffic, you could hear them say, we have the suspect, he says he's the only one. That sort of cleared up previous information that came across the scanner that said that there was many as 3. It's very important to make sure that you're putting the right information out there and not necessarily the first information that's out there.
One of the things that stood out to me last Wednesday as the shooter's motive in the Atlanta shooting was first reported was what felt to me, at least, to be a lot of what we might call stenography reporting, taking what a source gives you at face value and reporting it as such. And Ernest, I remember pulling into my garage Wednesday night, hearing the sheriff's spokesman say that the shooter had had a bad day and that shooting and killing 8 people of Asian heritage wasn't racially motivated. It was about a sex addiction. And he knew that because the suspect told the police officers about that. Talk for a minute for our audience's understanding, and heck, for mine too, why we should be as frustrated when that's the direction that a narrative takes.
Well, the reason you should be frustrated is because that's the first sort of official information that you receive. And because we have been conditioned when police officers or public officials make statements that somehow those statements carry the most weight. And I heard the same thing. It was that same day, and I went like, are you kidding me? You know, he was having a bad day. I had a bad day. There were a whole bunch of people had a bad day.
And when you have a bad day, I'm guessing your bad days look a little bit more like mine, where like our carb intake goes up or we go for a long walk. Like, a bad day doesn't end that way.
Right. Well, that's the first part of it. I mean, he did not have to say that. That's not what the sheriff needed to say. Okay. The other thing is, so the suspect said that it wasn't racially motivated. He could be saying that to try to get out of a charge of this being a hate crime, which would elevate it to an even higher felony count. So, and for the sheriff to come out and basically say that without actually having some sort of evidence, you're in the initial stages of your investigation, and you're gonna basically say that. I mean, that sort of information gets out there, and then people want to go, well, how do you know that? Because you'll have some people that'll accept it and say, well, okay, it wasn't racially motivated. He was just out there, shooting at massage parlors at random, and then you'll have others to go, whoa, wait a minute. So now you've got all of this chatter going back and forth about was it or was it not? And that seed of doubt is planted in there without any sort of evidence to back it up. And that coming from an official police source makes it very it's just not good journalism, and someone should have challenged them on that.
So in the moment, they weren't thinking fast enough. I'm going to make that conclusion for myself. They weren't thinking fast enough to do that. And Sheriff Deputy Baker, the communications person, his choice of words, following those, the reporters started to really take a look into his history and found proof of some anti-Asian biases that had been on social media. And that's where and when the narrative started to come into question. Kathy, I have to ask you, though, by that time, hasn't the harm already been done and the pain inflicted on victims' families and in the AAPI communities across the country?
Well, I'm gonna push back a little bit in defense of the reporters. Having done a lot of deadline reporting myself, when you're in a situation like that, you're under tremendous pressure. First of all, it's an incredibly shocking event, and that's going to have an impact. It has an impact not only on the victims, but to some extent on the people covering it. So you're a little bit in shock. You're on deadline. You know it's a big, important story, and in a way, reporting what the sheriff said is important. I mean, as if I were a voter in Cherokee County, I would want to know that this is the way my sheriff felt. And so that is a piece of the story. What the sheriff is saying is a piece of the story. And then kudos to the reporters for then taking the extra step and saying, wait a minute, what this guy said was outrageous. Who is this person? And so we can't always on deadline deliver the whole story all at once. And so I think what these reporters did was they reported what the sheriff said. He's a public figure. He's leading the investigation at that point. So you kind of got to go with him. But then quickly started to regroup and check things out. We wish we could deliver all the news all at once, but sometimes that just isn't humanly possible.
Well, I think Kathy's right on this, but the one thing I do want to say about that is I'm also looking at it from the other side, because if you're running a law enforcement agency in a metropolitan city, whether you're talking about the police department or sheriff, you should have professional public relations or crisis communications people doing it, not a sheriff person who doesn't have the training and understanding of what that means and know that, hey, I see myself being in a position where I'm going to deliver information to a larger audience. I want to make sure that I'm doing it right. So, I mean, that's where I really have the problem, because in today's age, any law enforcement, especially those who are in large metro areas or even smaller ones, should have professional crisis communications people doing this, or at least
have the sense to call for help from, you got mutual aid when you need to call for backup on the street. Call for backup when it comes to communication too, if you aren't equipped to do it on that level.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, but clearly the problem here was deeper than a lack of communications expertise.
You're right.
This guy's history is a little sketchy. Yeah.
So there were a couple of other really problematic aspects about the coverage of this event. And there were some things that AAJA, the Asian American Journalists Association, had done to proactively try to aid journalists across the country. They were kind of guiding people about how the use of language could come into play here, how the term spa over massage parlor should be used, about the hypersexualization of AAPI women, about a lot of the history that has come into play here. 2 days before that shooting in the Atlanta area, the first Asian American state senator in Georgia spoke out on the Senate floor about the dangers facing the community. She asked for support and protection. And after the incident, she said this.
These problems we're facing right now are not new. Okay? Discrimination and racism and violence against Asian Americans is not new. You have to remember, this is the same country we live in that put Japanese Americans in internment camps during World War II because our country could not conceive that people who look as foreign as those of us up here do to some could possibly have loyalty towards and allegiance to America. Misogyny and violence against women is not new. The epidemic of gun violence and gun injury is not new. What can be new is how we deal with it in this moment.
So, Earnest, one of the other points in the AAJA guidance that was issued is that journalists need to be much more aware of the racism against AAPI communities and how it's nuanced and complex and it's historically invisible. And to hear this state senator touch on that as she referenced the imprisonment of Japanese Americans during World War II, on some level, watching others around me, at least, it felt like there was this awakening in the last week that so many people have been trying to create an awareness of for a year and a half, for 70 years.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's what you're hearing now as it relates to Asian American and Pacific Islanders is similar to what we talked about on this show whenever there seems to be some sort of an incident involving Muslim Americans or Islamic Americans. So, again, here we are with an underrepresented, underreported on community finding itself in the spotlight because they've been, not further marginalized, but violently attacked. And so now all of a sudden people are going, as you were saying, this sort of awakening. It's always been there. These communities have always had to deal with these sorts of issues, whether it's, the whole issue of, well, our kids are smarter than your kids, therefore they're getting special dispensation and our kids aren't. The Asian American community has been fighting against that for a long time. It's not violence, but it does have an impact on their communities and the way in which they are viewed both in the media and within the larger community. So I hate that we've gotten to this point where we see it coming out in terms of violence against them, especially as it relates to the pandemic, which was pushed by the previous presidential administration. And then now you have this that happened to the workers at the spas in Atlanta. And to be honest with you, I don't think it's going to level off because at least this week I've heard, you still have this kind of violence going on as it relates to Muslim American communities. They're still facing it. And let's not even talk about the African American community, which is about to relive George Floyd all over again because the trial is set to start next week in Minneapolis. So we're gonna see a lot of this in ethnic minority communities over the course of the next year being highlighted, but you're going to continue to see it even moving forward.
One of the things that we have been saying, and this goes back to issues of racism, it goes to issues of gender discrimination. When someone tells you that they are experiencing something, when someone tells you that they are in fear, when someone tells you that they're being discriminated against, believe them, right? Connie Chung was on CNN this weekend and was pointing out how late the news media has been to open our eyes to ways that the AAPI communities are hurting and how white supremacy and that white nationalist rhetoric have really made that fear even more deep-seated. I worry, though, Kathy, what happens when we're in our newsrooms and our colleagues who are members of the AAPI communities are telling us what the conversations are they're having with their relatives or having with friends or neighbors or in shops, and they're sharing those with us or sharing those with news managers and they're not being listened to? How does that affect our coverage?
Well, I mean, I think there are two aspects of this, and we've been talking about it a lot at the Missouri School of Journalism with our students this week. And I think, first of all, it's one thing to have a diverse newsroom, and it's very important because we all come equipped with sets of blinders that we can't do anything about. It has to do with who we are and where we were born and how we grew up. But the only way we can see those blinders as if someone points them out to us. So by having newsrooms that are diverse, filled with people who have different life experiences and different political ideologies, we help to paint a bigger picture of our community. but that requires people feeling comfortable enough to speak out. And I think, and certainly I've talked about this with Asian American students and colleagues, there has been a tendency to not want to speak out because there's a fear that if I can just make myself invisible, if I can just not call attention to my difference, that somehow you can skate past all of this hate and disdain. And I think, one thing we know as journalists is sunlight is the best of disinfectants. And I think as painful as it is, by calling these things out and having these conversations, that's really our only chance of curing this. And this is a long-standing problem. I heard an interview on NPR, on KBIA, last night that really shocked me. A congressman, I think his first name is Andy Kim, had worked at the State Department. And he's of Korean descent. His family fled the North Koreans. And he was told he was not allowed to work on Korea issues. And as he pointed out,
there's no
German
better
Americans
expert.
are allowed to work on Germany. Mexican Americans can work on Mexico. It's just shocking how embedded this is in our culture and in places where you would think it shouldn't be. So we have a lot of work to do.
Well, I would just say to those who are speaking up and speaking out, there's probably always going to be one person in your newsroom who will listen and will be that ally who speaks up for you and be brave enough to do that. And there are people who will
and
stand
hopefully
with
more
you.
than one.
I hope that, and yes, in a good newsroom, more than one, but there's somebody who's there to stand with you. You might remember a few weeks ago, we told you about a member of the Biden communications team who resigned after threatening a reporter who was looking into his relationship with a journalist from Axios. That woman's name was Alexi McCammon. That was the girlfriend. Well, a few weeks ago, she was named the new editor-in-chief of Teen Vogue. And when her hiring was announced, staffers there were really vocal in voicing their anger about her hiring, pointing to some racist tweets she had posted when she was 17. Or was it? Kathy, there are a couple of different pieces on our links blog that point fingers in different directions. One of the most interesting ones comes from a blog called My New Band Is, and it suggests that the staff used the tweets as a vehicle to point out that she may be a terrific political reporter, but she wasn't the person to lead that publication.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is a complicated situation, and I think knees were jerking in all kinds of directions. But I think it's certainly a good lesson for anybody who uses social media. It can come back and bite you. We've seen examples of this before. And, were these tweets, which the reporter herself acknowledged were racist tweets sent when she was 17, so that's young, but not an infant. She acknowledged how bad they were, and should she have been elevated to this position, I think the staff, it wasn't so much a question of did she have the qualifications? I think it was a question of feeling this had just been glossed over by the people who were going to make the decision on hirings. Well, okay, it's okay. You've said you're sorry. Let's move on. And this is I think it's easy for people who are in the majority, who are white, to say, let's move on. But I think the people on the receiving end of these kind of insults have to be consulted, and they clearly felt they weren't.
Okay. I want to move on to a couple of the business of media types of stories before we go today. The first is about the NFL. It has inked a series of new media rights deals that pretty much ensure the league is the most valuable property on television. For the most part, things aren't going to look too different to fans at home. CBS will still have the bulk of the Sunday AFC games, and Fox will have the NFC games. The Sunday night game stays on NBC, and ESPN is going to hang on to Monday Night Football. The biggest change comes on Thursdays, when games will air in local markets, but only seen nationally by Amazon Prime subscribers. Kathy, that move is a real bet on the future of streaming for the NFL.
Yeah, and I think it's a sensible bet. I mean, clearly, appointment TV is going away, and streaming. A lot of people are cutting cords and changing their viewing habits, so it makes a lot of sense. But as we've discussed about other forms of entertainment on this show before, I think this is for consumers. It's going to be how many subscription services are you going to have to see your teams? Because I'm sure that Amazon is just the start.
So, Ernest, the league did this last season, televising one game exclusively on Amazon, and it only drew about 4 million people, which is really small compared to a regular nationwide audience.
Right. No, absolutely. I mean, I'm a little surprised by this. I thought maybe they would do this in partnership with one of the networks and do it that way, which is what they were doing prior to that one game you talked about last year. And now they moved into this, we're going to give them all the Thursday games. It's going to be interesting to see whether or not they're going to be able to keep that up, because people are going to have to make a decision. And some people, especially the older crowd, which still does watch the NFL games, whether or not they're going to be willing to do that.
Okay. Finally, before we go, there are these new things out there called NFTs, or non-fungible tokens. And I wish I could do a good job of explaining these things. I'll try. Basically, it's the original GIF or GIF, depending on how you pronounce it, of a piece of digital art. If you're confused, so were the folks at the Today Show following a report on these about 10 days ago.
Savannah has a very important question.
Yes. My question is, No, but really, what do you do with it? Like, if you have a digital file that you paid $2.5 million of. Yeah, but then what? You can't hang it up.
Yeah, I know. Well, I guess you could say it's kind of like
and then you show it to your friend.
You're like, here it is. I have it right here. And they're like, yeah, me too. And it looks the exact same.
But I paid for it. I paid $2.5 million for it.
Yeah.
So Time Magazine, and you can read more about this on our links blog, but Time Magazine is currently auctioning off 3 of its covers in this format. Ernest, I don't know, do you remember that video of Katie Couric and Bryant Gumbel talking about this new thing, email, from like 20 years ago? People are going to need to read more about this, but is this going to be one of those clips we want to hold on to for 20 years from now when NFTs become the most common way of collecting or trading art? Or is it so obscure that it's going to be like the Blu-ray of 2021?
You just don't know. You don't know whether or not it's going to take off. But the fact that somebody paid that kind of money for it sort of surprises me, when, in fact, anyone could get it. So Time Magazine is auctioning this off, but there are ways that people could get that. I'm not sure whether it's going to hang on. But then again, I was a skeptic of social media, and a lot of it is taken off. So there you go.
Kathy, I'm going to put you on the spot too. Any predictions on the future for the NFT?
Well, I'm with Earnest. Who knows? I think I highly recommend. Was a really interesting interview. Kara Swisher, the great technology writer who now works for the New York Times, did a podcast with the artist who made $69 million from this. And he's a believer, but even he's a little surprised.
Okay. Well, thanks for spending the last half hour with us. You can read more about each of the topics we talked about today on our links blog. That's under both the programs and podcast tabs at kbia.org. We're also on where you can find us wherever you get your podcast downloads, including iTunes, Spotify, and Stitcher. Like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter, where our handle is @ViewsOnKBIA. You can watch and listen to our program again, leave comments and questions, and see what we'll be talking about on our next program and more. Thanks to RJI's Travis McMillan, to Aaron Hay for handling the audio, and Tim Pilcher for our original theme music.